time to mention, except to say briefly that humans now use directly or indirectly about half of the available fresh water of the planet, so there's not too many doublings left. We are losing productive land globally to urban expansion and past unsustainable use. Most of the world's fisheries are at peak production or in decline, and we are still losing forest cover around the world at an alarming rate. I've told a few people here that when I was at the Commission for the Future, I told Philip Adams, who was our chairman, that the world was losing forest at the rate of a football field a second. And he told me that he was a founding member of a Victorian group called the Anti-Football League. He thinks that Australians spend far too much time and energy watching grown men chasing an inflated pigskin around muddy fields. And he said the obvious solution is to reforest football fields, preferably at the rate of one a second, which he said would both solve the problem and strike a blow for world peace. The serious point is that most of the important renewable resources are being overused, and they will not be available in the same quantity to future generations. In terms of our economic future, in one sense Australia is already a post-industrial economy in the sense in which Barry Jones used that expression in Sleeper's Wake 25 years ago. The majority of us in Australia no longer produce minerals or agricultural produce or manufactured goods. Those sectors together account for about a quarter of the Australian economy and about 1/5 of the jobs. The overwhelming majority of us are in the services sector, where services used most charitably to include disservices like advertising. Our broad economic problem is that we trade commodities to the world and import value-added goods and services. And technological change has meant that commodities are steadily less valuable compared with the value-added goods and services that we import. Barry Jones used to say that we export iron ore at $5 a tonne and import ball bearings at $5,000 a tonne. A more down-to-earth example is that the laptop computer on which I produced this presentation contains, by my estimate, about $50 worth of raw materials. It sells for $5,000, so somebody buying it is paying $4,950 for the intellectual process of transforming those small quantities of metals and alloys and composites and plastic into a device that performs a useful service. And economically, we're concentrating on selling the $50 worth of materials and buying the $4,950 worth of transformation. Anybody who was looking ahead would see education and research as investments in our future rather than cost items in the budget, arguably the best possible investments in our future. And I think they would also say that if we look at Australia's comparative advantage, its main one is our quality of life. And we should be trying to nurture that quality of life above crude economic indicators. In terms of social cohesion, the Australia that I grew up in was one of the most equal societies there has ever been in the world. The basic wage set a minimum salary, at least for those of us who chose our chromosomes carefully, and managerial salaries only ranged up to about 10 times that basic wage. And there was a good system of public provision of education, healthcare and transport that meant that people like me who chose both their parents and their postcode carelessly and grew up in a small country town in the bush could still get a decent education and aspire to a professional career. Today, Australia is one of the most unequal countries in the entire OECD. More of us have casual jobs, while at the other end, more of us have multi-million-dollar salary packages. And as I said before, we've steadily run down the public provision of education and health and transport in favour of a private provider model. It seems to me axiomatic that we should aim to ensure that all Australians should be able to realise their potential physically, intellectually and emotionally, however carelessly they chose their parents. Barry Jones pointed out when he was Science Minister that the best indicator of your life chances in Australia is the care with which you chose your parents' postcode. And he made the point that most of us make that choice quite early in life, so it probably shouldn't be held against us forever. In ecological terms, this is the bottom line, the overall ecological footprint of humanity. the percentage of the biologically productive land needed to provide the goods and services that we use. 50 years ago, it was about half of the sustainable productivity of the biosphere. Today, it's about 120%. In other words, we are operating at an ecological deficit. And in this age of fiscal rectitude, when it's almost a hanging offence for a government to run a fiscal deficit, it's surprising that we are as sanguine as we are about the rundown of the ecological systems on which future generations will depend. Let me say something about a few specific issues, like climate change. I wrote a paperback book about climate change nearly 20 years ago, and at the time this was dismissed as wild-eyed lunacy by the keepers of the intellectual wisdom in Australia. Now even the Prime Minister is prepared to say that climate change is real, although his body language suggests he doesn't really believe it. But the evidence is very clear. Australia has warmed significantly, rainfall patterns have changed, there are more frequent severe events and so on. And the changes are not uniform. That's the point of this map, on which the average temperature changes of the last 100 years are shown in different colours. Australia, on average, has warmed by about 0.7 degrees, and as you would expect, the largest areas of Australia have warmed by between 0.5 degree and 1 degree. But there are quite large areas, including where we are now, that have warmed by between 1 and 1.5 degrees, and some significant areas, including about half of South Australia and about a third of the Northern Territory, that have warmed by between 1.5 and 2 degrees. In other words, the change of the last 100 years has not been uniform, and any changes in the future will similarly not be uniform. That's even more true of rainfall. On this map, the areas that have become wetter are shown in blue. The darker the blue, the greater the increase in rainfall, and those which have become drier are red, and the darker the red, the greater the decrease. And the reason that the Australian population now perceives that we are drier is that it is drier where 80% of us live. Australia as a whole is actually slightly wetter, but the rainfall has been significantly redistributed away from where most of us live to areas where very few of us live. The situation is particularly acute in Perth, where the declining rainfall is compounded by increasing temperature, so the ground is hotter and drier when it does rain, so less of the rain that falls finishes up in the water supply reservoirs. 2 points that are apparent from this graph showing the annual inflow to Perth's water supply system. The first is that Australia is not just the driest inhabited continent, but it is also the inhabited continent with the most variable rainfall, where in some places like Western Europe, the difference between a wet year and a dry year might be a factor of 2. In parts of Australia, it's a factor of 30 or a factor of 40. And you can see that if you look at the difference, say, between a year like that and a year like that. The other point is that before 1975, although there's an enormous amount of fluctuation, the average annual runoff to Perth's water supply system was 338 gigalitres. Since 1975, it's been 164. And since 1997, it's been 115. In other words, it's now about a third of what it was before 1975. And when I used this graph at a conference in Victoria, the Victorian Water Minister put up an almost identical graph for the runoff to the water supply system of Ballarat. And last month in Tasmania, a Tasmanian scientist put up a graph for the rainfall at Sorell on the east of the Derwent River, which showed the same sort of pattern. I mean, it's starting to look like a bit of a trend that we need to take account of, that climate change is not just increasing the temperature, but also changing rainfall patterns in exactly the way that the science was predicting 20 years ago that it would. And I think it's salutary that governments put great faith in economic models, most of which have never made a successful forecast in their life, but were quite unwilling to believe climate models which were actually making forecasts 20 years in advance that have been borne out. The fundamental reason is that we're, by burning fossil fuels, putting increasing amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This graph has now been extended back 650,000 years from polar ice cores, and we know that over that entire period, the amount of carbon dioxide in the air has fluctuated between about 180 and 280 parts per million. It's now about 380 and heading north at a rate of knots.